This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, or so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Hi there. This guest I was introduced to a number of years ago, Edward Hall, an assistant professor of sociology of sport at Northumbria University. Edward, well, he has an extensive experience working in sport coaching, as a coach himself in rugby, as a coach educator, and as a researcher. Today we discuss the coaching team, collaborative coaching, mechanisms that build trust between coaches and practitioners, the preparation, and there's an awful lot that is involved when coaching, and a whole lot more. Hi, Edward. It's great to have you on the show. Would you be able to share with the listener a little bit about your background and your interest in coaching?
Yeah, it's great to be with you, David. So I work in Northumbria University. I'm an assistant professor there, and I have a background in coaching practice that stretches back 2 decades now, predominantly within the context of rugby union for a large number of those years, but increasingly across a range of different sport environments, levels. Started off as a community coach, working in my local club, coaching the local teams, and progressed to be that my job. Was very fortunate to earn a living from coaching, both in the kind of community development sector initially, and more recently within the elite or high performance context, if you want to characterize it as those sorts of things, basically where winning mattered quite a bit. And as part of my development as a practitioner, I really sought out different ways of understanding my practice and questioning it and being curious about it and finding answers. And the academic world really spoke strongly to me and offered me something that I didn't get out of the coaching qualifications and CPD courses that I did lots and lots of. So yeah, a decade ago now, I undertook and completed my master's degree and then a PhD. And really since then, I wouldn't separate theory and practice. I don't see any distinction for myself between the identities that I have as a practitioner or somebody who's academic or does research. That they infuse one another in the work that I do, and that's very pertinent to the support that I give other practitioners now as a mentor and as a consultant to coaches and governing bodies and different types of practitioners. Is that everything that I'm doing is informed not only by the practical experiences that I have, but also by the theory and the knowledge that underpins those things for myself and for other people.
I'm intrigued. You talked there about where winning mattered and I suppose the difference between community and high performance. Do you want to just elaborate a little bit more on that and some of your experiences, what you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a false binary in some respects, because even when I was a very mediocre athlete, playing in what would be classed as a community context where we weren't being paid for the work we did, for the playing that we did, like winning really mattered. Like I really wanted to win, and that was a big part of the motivation for putting in the hours of training and being part of the team and all the things that I enjoyed about being part of the club. But it mattered in terms of it was in the contract. So I was getting paid, and part of the performance indicators that helped those that paid me to decide whether I was doing a good job was about the number of W's and that I got. And I speak about this quite a bit with others. You can't separate the two in performance sport. So if you perform now as a performance team, and then you don't develop, then your performance isn't going to win again in the future, because the other teams or the other athletes, they're all getting better at what they do. So whether it's in the the practice that I do with athletes, or whether it's in the mentoring consultancy work that I do supporting practitioners, coaches predominantly, what I'm keen to explore with them is how they continue to develop their performance. And I see that performance as occurring in a range of different ways. It's not only about the winning or the losing, the qualities of the action that we undertake, but it's also recognizing that we are performing to a role, to a set of expectations, and to a set of almost characters in the different positions that we hold. And so that notion of performance really underpins theoretically a number of the pieces of research that I've undertaken, and much of the work that really speaks to me from other scholars within the area as well.
And a particular bit of research, which is quite recent, I believe, is collaborations amongst coaches. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's recently published, although it's a long-term project. So this is a 6-year study, more of a decade-long process in terms of undertaking the research. And it was really to understand the workplace collaborations that occur between co-coaches, people who work together. In this case, it was with rugby coaches who were professionally employed as part of a coaching team to achieve the organization's goals, and to really dig deeply into the doing of that work as a collective, because much of the existing work in that space, the existing research, and also much of the coach education that you get is about what you do as an individual. It's about how you conduct yourself alone. And for many people, that's rarely or simply not the case. For most people, they are undertaking their sports work as part of a collective rather than as a lone individual.
And yeah, the collective can have a huge impact, can't it? Because if you've got, I don't know, you've got values, you've got personality styles, you've got time, resources, all those factors surely are going to shape how well people will actually work together.
Absolutely. And for me, this is a fundamentally sociological question. It's about the organization and the doing of social life, and the conduct of interactions, the interconnected networks that we're part of within these sports worlds that we occupy. And if you look at most of the existing literature within these topic areas, the nature of coaches' relationships or practitioners' relationships as a whole has been presented quite negatively, or in quite a dark light. And this reveals that a lot of co-coaches hold personal fears for their job safety, especially professional coaches. They perceive there to be competitive rivalries even amongst the colleagues that they work with. And consequently, there's a strong concern for their self-interests, the motives that drive them. And against that backdrop, but also one of like limited job opportunities in professional sport, insecure and short-term contracts, impatient employers that we've kind of referred to already in terms of being hungry for success, but also like a ready queue of well-qualified and experienced practitioners waiting behind you to fill your spot if you get the nudge. It means that literature has been able to reveal a great deal about some of the Machiavellian behaviours in the way that people look out only for their own selves, and see themselves competing against these supposed rivals, even though they might otherwise be considered to be cooperative colleagues within sport organisations. And so really this research that we're talking about today, it offers an alternative view, not because that stuff isn't happening, but perhaps a view at a context in where the co-coaching was happening in more productive and collaborative ways, though certainly not free from some of those problematic elements of the joint venture of coaching together that you've already referred to.
So it's going to be very different from, I suppose, working as a community coach and as an elite coach. There's going to be more personnel, I suppose, in the teams, if you like, in comparison to being a community coach. So yeah, I mean, has that been part of your research as well?
In this study, we worked with one sport organisation and the collective of coaches that they had, which was a professional rugby team. And within my experience across other professional rugby teams, they broadly had a similar number of resources at their disposal, people who were fulfilling different roles. And that wasn't just coaches, it was performance analysts, it was medical staff, it was strength conditioners, and so on and so forth. And obviously, that differs depending upon what context you're working in. But certainly my experience and what I see in community context, if I think about my son's rugby clubs, there's 3 or 4 coaches, willing parents, volunteers, guardians, and so on, who are part of a collective whole that is supposed to deliver this thing called coaching. And so for us, it was really interesting, along with my co-authors on this paper, Dr. Adam Nichol, Callum Morgan, Mark McCutcheon, and Professor Paul Potrak, of digging into, well, how is it then that they go about this quite problematic joint work? Because it isn't straightforward, as you pointed out, to bring together these different people with all the baggage that they have and produce something that is coherent and collaborative and collective in the work that they do.
So I would imagine preparation is one of those key things. So do you want to just share a little bit more with the listeners about the preparation phase?
Yeah, so preparation was really key amongst a number of important features of the doing of this collective work. And a lot of the findings that we're going to discuss, they reflect what's been found in other work occupation areas around group dynamics. So whether it's police officers or music groups or civil servants or school teachers or surgeons, there are a number of similarities that came through in the data set that we generated across this 6-year ethnographic study. And planning was part of a cyclical approach. So they would engage in extensive planning, often for longer in duration than the actual performance episode, the session, or the match that occurred when they were in front of their athletes, or if you like, the audience that they were performing for. And then that cycle of planning and enacting was followed by an evaluation or reflecting phase, but not just looking back at what had happened, always looking forward at how they could then inform the planning that they then did for subsequent teamwork. And at the heart of this planning process and what we call the team performance, the doing of the teamwork of these practitioners, was the desire to remain aligned to one another, being on the same page, singing from the same hymn sheet, in order to generate good impressions of their practice in the minds of people that made up their audiences. And those audiences were players, they were opposition teams and coaches, it was colleagues within the club, and at times one another, but anyone who could witness them doing their collaborative work. And they recognized that their work was going to be scrutinized, that their audiences would make sense of and interpret and evaluate the things that they did together. And that in order to get those people on board, those people needed to trust and respect the work that these coaches were doing as a collective. And so consequently, their ability to implement the coaching program and philosophies that they had of how to coach and what to coach was really dependent on them getting right the collective work that they did together. And so they planned extensively, and what they planned for maybe deviates slightly from the things that we're often asked to think about as practitioners when we're educated about planning, which is about the X's and the O's and where the bibs and the balls and the cones are going to go and what activities the athletes are going to do. All really important stuff, by the way, certainly not to undermine that. But what these coaches showed, and which reflects a growing and clear picture within the sports coaching literature, is that in order to be able to do these roles, the central skill that they were engaged with was being socially persuasive and influential together. And so they needed to be able to generate practice in such ways that convinced those followers, their athletes, for example, to go along with their plans. And there was a great risk to them that they could undermine that themselves by being incoherent as a team of practitioners, by stepping on people's toes, interrupting each other, providing confusing messages, or contradicting one another's points of view. So they were very, very careful to prepare for that. So how they did that was really, really interesting. Like I said, they spent huge amounts of time doing it, which is certainly a challenge for those not operating in high performance or professional contexts. But they were very careful to do that planning away from the gaze of the audience who would be scrutinizing them. So they had a coach's office, but they also had WhatsApp groups and other means of shielding from other people's view the extensive work that went into producing the performances that they could then give when they were on the front stage in front of their athletes. And absolutely key to it, the thing that they were most concerned with, and this is really interesting if you think about it in the context of a collaborative team, a group that are characterized as being very good colleagues, is it was proactively expected that they challenged and disagreed with each other. So whilst they were shielded from view, they weren't concerned with the niceties of appearing to all be on the same page. What they were concerned with was refining and developing what would become a coherent performance in front of their athletes. And that meant that they expected other people to say, well, how's that going to work? What does that mean? I disagree with that. I think it should be done in this way, in these forms, with these athletes doing this stuff. And it was through those forms of deliberate disagreement, purposeful disagreement, that they were able to refine and to develop their ideas. And they did that by generating these very extensive scripts and rehearsed solutions to the great number of contingent ways that their practice could pan out. So, for example, if you thought that we should be attacking in a particular way within this team, and I thought something different, we would debate that a number of times. One of the coaches said, we'd have 6 different versions of that bit of the plan before it actually made it onto the session plan, for sure, and they'd map it out on the whiteboard. But beyond just knowing what they were going to do, they wanted to share with each other why they thought that was a good idea. So that if I was asked by an athlete, well, why are we doing this thing that you, David, you're leading as the head coach? I'd be able to give a convincing, sincere, and clear answer, rationale and justification for why we were doing that, even if I, in the backstage, might have disagreed with it originally. So that was absolutely essential to the doing of their work, was this really deep, rich planning activity.
Yeah, because all it takes is, I suppose, a player to question a particular move or that they're trying to do, and a coach to say, I don't know, it's not my doing, and then straight away that cohesion and those messages are lost.
Exactly, and it highlights this really fundamental element that when you're practicing together, you're interconnected. So you're not just a collection of individuals. So if we're on a team and people who are observing us think badly of me, that has consequences for you as a member of our team as well. And so it's in each of our interests to develop our practice in ways that, whilst we might have different views and certainly we might go about our practice in unique and nuanced ways, there is still centrally a coherence and an alignment to what it is that we do when we're out there.
So I would imagine in this preparation phase and these different discussions, meetings, how we're going to behave when we are questioned, when A happens, B happens, C happens, is part of that phase.
Absolutely. And here we see the planning of the coaches going well beyond just the what of practice. It became extensively about the who and the when and the where and the why and the how.
Yeah.
And so it might be, well, who's going to speak in that water break? And whilst they're speaking, who's doing these other jobs? And where will they be doing that such that it doesn't distract from the messages that are being shared with the athletes during the water break? And how might that enable the flow of the session? So might there be some assistant coaches who are busily preparing the next activity, so that as soon as the key messages that are being passed from the head coach to their athletes in the huddle are concluded, the athletes can very quickly flow into what looks like a very organized, well set out, well thought through activity coming up, which might actually have been refined from the original session plan because of how the session to that point has unfolded, because these coaches have been coordinating their activity so well together.
And sport has a great way of throwing like chaos at us as well. So obviously that's going to be part of the preparation side.
100%. So there were these really important concepts which come from Irving Goffman, a fabulous sociologist who gives us great insights into the work, but which were really strongly evident in the practice of these coaches when they got into the doing of it. So beyond the planning phase, if you like, but into the enacting of their practice. And a lot of that reflects the fact that coaching, as with lots of things, is a very uncertain activity. So we have limited control. Not everybody might turn up today. People might be injured. Performances could be very different than they were the last time we were working with these athletes. And we have limited awareness. So we might not know what mood that person's in or how they're feeling honestly and truthfully inside about the things that we're saying to them. So these coaches, they weren't going in with rose-tinted specs on, thinking their practice was going to be perfect and aligned and coherent all of the time. It very proactively explored the contingencies that might need to happen in order to be able to, whilst retaining their coherence, be agile and adapt to the unfolding session. But at the heart of that, they kept a couple of really important things very dear to their practice. And this was about being disciplined, and it was about being loyal. So being disciplined for them meant avoiding disruptions that could be caused by forgetting the role that you should be playing as a coach in the plan at this point in time, avoiding deviating from that plan wherever possible, as much as there was inevitable adaptability, and indeed failing to adapt coherently to the emergent conditions or nature of the practice that occurred. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But the other element was of loyalty. And this was about remaining always loyal to the other members of the team that you were on as a co-coach. So there was a shared moral obligation to not betray the shared secrets of what had gone on in the backstage whilst they were preparing and planning. And this meant that what the audience should experience when the coaching was happening, irrespective of the great uncertainty and dynamic nature and complexity of how coaching unfolds, is that the coaches should appear collectively and individually, on the surface at least, to our eyes as the audience members, to be at ease, to be carrying out their practice unfazed and with a degree of nonchalance, but also integrity and sincerity that made the athletes continue to trust and respect and believe and therefore follow and comply with the things that they were being asked to do. So to give you a practical example of this, they'd planned, the coaches, to have two simultaneous mirror images of the session happening at the same time. One group would be over here, another group over there, and two coaches would be leading those simultaneous sessions. And there was a third coach, the head coach, that would move between these sessions and input where they could in particular roles. And they planned the way that this was going to work. But one of the coaches, the person who'd gone to the left of the pitch, they got their plan a little bit wrong. So they didn't make the pitch big enough to enable the activity to achieve the objectives that it was going to. And the other coach had made their pitch big enough. And so there was a real risk that the players in pitch A would get different learning and different outcomes, different opportunities to explore their performance and their development than the other group. And then when they came back together for the rest of the session, that would affect the rest of the plan. It would have this domino knock-on effect. So by being disciplined, the head coach who was floating between the two noticed this and very quickly, and actually with my help, we got some new cones and we made a new line to make the pitch bigger. But we did this very kind of carefully and sort of secretly because the players were still busy occupied doing the activity that their respective assistant coaches were running. And when this had happened, the head coach then again, quietly and without drawing attention to themselves, they moved around the pitch nearer to the assistant coach that was running pitch A and highlighted the issue that had occurred. They then returned back to the middle of the pitch. And when the whistles went for these two assistant coaches to then call in their groups and move the session on a little bit, the coach on pitch A was very easily able to go, right, so we've added a new line in. We want you to expand the way you're playing. We want you to think about these attacking options. In the minds of the players, this was a natural evolution of how the session was meant to have run all along. It didn't appear that anything had gone wrong. It certainly didn't appear that any cover-up had happened. It was just a very neat, very well executed sort of extension of where they'd already been going. And loyalty came into the picture here because the head coach could have stopped everything. They could have blown the whistle. They had the authority to do it. They could have said, no, you've got it all wrong. The pitch needs to be bigger. It needs to be like this. You've limited the options. They could have thrown that other coach under the bus a little bit. But actually, they enabled that coach to carry off their practice as if it had always been intended as such. And so, at least in the minds of the audience, they were none the wiser to what could have been a distracting or derailing aspect of what is inevitable, that we will always perhaps make mistakes, that things won't run as smoothly. But as long as we're loyal, as long as we plan well together, and as long as we're disciplined in the carrying out of that work, then we can cope with that and we can adapt as the session unfolds.
There was one word I wrote down there as you were talking through was accountability, which really you've answered. But I suppose really the skill of the practitioner or the coach there in terms of accountability is showing some empathy and having realistic expectations that mistakes will happen essentially.
Absolutely, and this is where these coaches were certainly much more deeply philosophical, less ideological than we might have seen in existing coaching literature or in practice as well. And this had some really beneficial consequences, the way that they protected one another when they were out on the field, if you like. When they got back into the coaches' meeting room after the session, they engaged in these really fascinating post-mortems of what had just happened. These weren't just casual reflections. Oh yeah, that went well, the players did all right. And these were like deep, really significant unpackings and examinations, interrogations of their practice. But rather than that happening as it did in the planning phase, where one coach would go, no, I disagree, and I don't like that, and I think you should do it this way, and how can we make that different? Here, because they looked out for each other, it was like a confessional. So a coach would go, I don't think I got that right today. And often what would happen, rather than there being any extensive kind of negative focus on it, the other coach would often forgive their sins. Don't worry, I don't think anybody noticed. It was all right. Or, don't worry, I think it got some great outcomes in these other ways. I think we can carry that forward into the next session. And indeed, a lot of their focus became instead on, well, how do we build on that for the next session? Or how do we guard against it so that we can be even more coherent as a team in the future? And this pattern of confession, forgiveness, and then deep interrogation when they got back into the planning phases really meant that the coaches felt secure with one another to both expose their ideas and their practices to the scrutiny of their teammates before they went out onto the pitch to carry out their practice, but to also be open to other people's ideas, to listen to different thoughts, because it was always done with the intention of helping to improve their collective practice and of advancing and enhancing what they were going to do together, rather than pointing the finger and being competitive with one another, as we've seen in some of that other good literature that's out there already.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. This, I suppose, it smacks a little bit of psychological safety there and being able to share vulnerability. which, yeah, as you mentioned earlier, must be, well, yeah, very difficult in a certainly in a high performance environment where there's results and there'll be people at the top of the organization as well casting their words of wisdom. Yeah, fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that can't be underestimated in relation to this particular group, and we've already said it about why they were doing this together, is because they wanted their audiences to trust and respect them. They wanted the buy-in of these people. But underpinning that was a deep level of trust and respect for one another, and a security that had been developed over time, but also very purposefully and proactively to feel safe and secure, to challenge one another in the backstage, to back one another up by being loyal and disciplined in the front stage, and to admit one's sins when they got back in to review that work afterwards. And that's really where some of our future research will go, is to explore the mechanisms that help to generate trust and solidarity between practitioners, in order to enable these good practices to come through in terms of co-coaching.
Yeah, and I suppose that must be very difficult. If I suppose if we could rewind back to the start of the episode where we talked about the winning side of things, if the team is losing and there is like pressure placed on people, then yeah, obviously teams can fall apart, can't they? And that collective goal of trust, if you like, can go out the window.
I think with this particular group, they had because they spent so much time planning together, and planning wasn't just very purposefully discussing what the session is going to be like or how they're going to approach this particular match. It was discussing practice. It was thinking actively together about the sport. And so they shared a very central affinity to particular ways of thinking about the doing of their work. And this really helped them to have not only conversations that were productive in terms of the practice that they engaged in, but which helped them to strongly believe in and to sustain that belief when things didn't go well, when it was tough, when they didn't achieve the outcomes that they were hoping for. It kept them on course to stick to what they believed, because they'd held each other to such high account, to such high standards, and exposed themselves to such levels of scrutiny before they'd engaged in it, that they were really convinced that these were good ways to go about the doing of that practice, which was, again, very fruitful for them when they faced all the uncertainty that inevitably coaches do. It enabled them to be agile and to be adaptable whilst retaining a sense of coherence to the work that they did.
There's two facets that I often talk about on the podcast here, is the fact if you're going to try and improve, well, be it a coach, an athlete, you've got to be looking for self-awareness essentially, and this is critical in this respect. And then you've got an element of mental toughness as learning orientation. So yeah, being able to reflect, look in the mirror, obviously learn from your mistakes. Again, the vital components. And I suppose to some coaches that wouldn't be natural to them.
I think a lot of coaches are really keen learners, and one of the things that I think coach education, and this goes for the types of coach education I'm involved in, mentoring and coach development work, but also in higher education and in industry qualifications, is to help people to sort of demystify their learning process. So the way in which they're going about that activity. And for these coaches, it was, they were very explicit. Well, I might try this today. What do you think about that? I've never tried that before. And I would hear conversations between these, and it's not so much within the paper, but just it's part of the wider, 6 years, there was a lot of data. So there's a lot of data that's not in the paper. But they would say, I'm going to try this. And another coach would say, well, in the bigger picture, actually, two of us are thinking of trying something new today. That's maybe a bit too much inconsistency from what the players are used to. So tell you what, you try your thing today, and let's think about a really good opportunity to try that other thing another time. So they weren't just paying attention to these like micro focus details of what was going to happen in this one session tomorrow. They were focused on how that fit within the bigger picture of not only their athletes' learning, development, and performance, but also their own learning, development, and performance that were layered on top of one another.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I suppose one thing you're saying there is, again, it links a little bit to mental toughness in that you have a measure is called risk orientation. So you'll have some people who are higher risk takers than others. It'll be very easy for some coaches to go off track, but it sounds like obviously, yeah, this particular group have worked really well in that respect.
I think a lot of that was down to the manager, the head coach. They were very astute at leading, but also engaging the members of that team in feeling part of that process and feeling valued and actively contributing to the nature of the practice that they were engaged in. And they showed this through at times being the person to resolve a debate that wasn't moving quickly enough towards alignment during the planning stage, where they would say, okay, I need to make a decision about this because we need to be on the same page by the time we get to the session at 3 o'clock this afternoon. And so they would take that pressure away from the others who were struggling perhaps to agree. And at times they would do this by almost stepping away from that position of authority. So to give an example, they had an attack coach, somebody whose job it was to decide and to coach predominantly how the team was going to attack. And whilst they sometimes held different views about this from the attack coach, as a head coach, they recognized that that was the person's job. And so even though they would challenge and probe and they might offer alternative points of view, they would often say, look, this is your role, so I want you to lead on this. But let's be really clear about what it is you're wanting us to do, what that'll look like, how each of us can play a role in contributing to that, and even to the extent of rehearsing scripts that they would use to inform how they spoke to people about those underpinning rationales, as we've already talked about, so that they felt that they could do justice to this person's alternative idea in order to sustain the loyalty and the discipline that was necessary to their collective practice when they were out there in front of these scrutinizing audiences.
Yeah. Yeah, because I suppose the danger would be you end up stifling some creativity in the coaches, but if it's managed well, and then that shouldn't be the case.
And that became really evident as well when they were out on the pitch doing their training. So that notion of creativity might seem constrained by the extent of the planning that they did. But the planning wasn't just to stick rigidly to the plan. The planning was done in order to enable the agility and the adaptability. And they built in things that enabled them within the session the opportunity to connect with one another again whilst they were in the midst of coaching, to share how they felt things were going, what might need to be adapted, and to make sure that, again, even though they were under time pressure and in the scrutiny of their audience, that they were able to evolve what they were doing coherently. And they used forms of camouflage to do this. So they would gather the players into a huddle, for example. And whilst one coach occupied them with that, perhaps discussing an element of the tactics or the techniques that were crucial to what they were doing, the other coaches, unbeknownst to the athletes who are now occupied in their own huddle, would be off describing, well, we might need to adapt that session because that player has just dropped out. I think we're getting really good value out of these activities. So let's scrap the planned activity 3 and replace it with a bit longer of activity 4. But let's make the pitch a bit narrower and let's give these 2 players some bibs so that they are involved in the session in this particular way. Now, to the players' minds, none of that stuff has happened because they're not consciously aware of it. And so that camouflage was enabled by 2 things. One, it was enabled by making somebody conspicuous. So the coach that was running that huddle was the star of that show, and all the players' attention were on them. And to be disciplined and loyal, they had to play their part in keeping the players' attention on them. Equally, there was camouflage because they would retreat just far enough away that their own discussions didn't impede or distract from the ones that were happening in the players' huddle. And that equally their discussion wrapped up and concluded so that they were back in position, ready to go again for as soon as that major huddle had concluded. So there was a lot of very careful coordination and not just self-awareness, and you rightly highlighted that before, because that was integral to doing your own job, but social awareness of what else was going on around them so that they were in tune with one another and with the context and the unfolding circumstances that they operated in.
It's fascinating because, yeah, if you were an observer just watching, you would be, all right, yeah, group of coaches getting together, one coach with the players, but actually it's been well thought out and crafted.
And they
Yeah.
provided, there were great examples, and there's some really rich data and detail within the paper of this particular example where some of that was non-verbal. So even within huddles that the coaches were part of, they would use body language, subtle gestures to one another that would allow them to plan ahead for things that were immediately about to happen. So they would, sort of nod their head. Do you want to input anything into this huddle? Whilst after that other person's concluded their points, they might look at their watch as if to indicate, are we on time? Do we need a little bit more? Have we done enough now? Sometimes um, they would very carefully purse their lips, say, no, I don't want to say anything else. I'm happy with everything that's been done. They would offer a very subtle thumbs up as if to say, like, that's been a class session. I'm really happy with that. And that would allow the coach who's now about to address the players as a whole to be confident to say, we're really happy with how you've done today, players. Well done. Really, really good. Knowing that they're not going to set up an awkward situation later when one of the coaches reveals that actually they were quite disappointed with the session through their body language or the way that they interact with the players. So this camouflage wasn't just about these very sort of physical and practical and tangible things. It was about understanding the sensory perception of their athletes and playing with the distances and the awareness that their athletes had of them, not just their athletes, the other audiences as well, in order to be able to maintain this front of being a very coherently organized, adaptable, sincere, authentic, and authoritative team in their everyday practice.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff. I'm aware of time, Ed. So can you summarize this for, well, our conversation for some coaches, and pinpoint three key takeaways that coaches can take from this conversation?
I guess I want coaches to recognize that there's no recipe for this. Okay, so the things that we've talked about, the things that are in the paper, they aren't a ticky box list that coaches should do. And so I'd maybe offer three questions to reflect with, to think about, and to ponder on in order to try and explore their ongoing co-coaching. So the first would be, how detailed and intricate is your planning for how you're going to coach together as a team? So this is about going beyond the X's and the O's and the easy stuff that we always think about, if you like, not that it's all easy. But if your depth of conversation only goes as far as who's taking what section of the overall session, then you're likely to encounter threats and challenges to the coherence of that over time. So if you find yourself or you notice other co-coaches standing back or appearing to not have a purpose in the session, then it's evident that they're not clear about the role that they could be playing. And you're probably not getting the most out of your group as a collective or the resources that are available to you at that time. If so, try and bring more of the attention and the focus in your planning to what you are collectively going to be doing at what times. So it's all those questions of who, when, where, why, and how, not just the what. The what's very important, but you need to add the layers of that detail as a collective. Then it would be, how can you be more careful, more prudent, and more honest in the deliberations that you have before and after the coaching that you engage in? who's going to speak about what in that water break? Are they the best person to speak about those things? After they've spoken, who are they going to pass to? How many points are we going to make then? How many is too many? What might distract or overload the athletes at this particular time? If those coaches are doing that stuff, well, what are the other coaches doing at that point? And how can we all, as a collective, feel that at every point during the session, we're doing something that is purposeful, that is contributing to the thrust and the direction of the collaborative coaching that we're doing? But also, what are we going to do if it goes wrong? Like, how can we anticipate together the contingencies that might be needed to deal with the realities of practice? And then the third one would go back to that point about the camouflage and the conspicuous nature of being on the main stage. So can you incorporate purposeful points of connection between your co-coaches in the doing of your coaching practice? Can you plan them in a way that enables you to take stock of what's happening, to debate and discuss quite concisely what you're going to do next, and to check in with one another in terms of what you're seeing, feeling, and doing as practitioners? And that's therefore going to lead you to have discussions around, well, how are we going to, what value are the athletes going to get out of that time? What might they be doing instead whilst we're checking in with one another? How are we going to plan that, yes, this activity is going to last for 5 minutes, but that when we reach minute 4, these two coaches who are running these parallel sessions are going to connect in between the two pitches in order to share their observations while still maintaining oversight of the activity, so that they can run straight into some kind of collective discussion beyond it. And what's each member of that group going to do in pursuit of aligned and complementary team practices that go back to the ultimate foundation stones of what we've discussed today, which is about the loyalty and the discipline that we have when we're engaging in co-coaching practice.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, there was I think a lot more than 3 points there, but that's absolutely fine. It's great. I'm sure the listeners will really enjoy this. Yeah, in terms of yourself, if people want to reach out to you and ask any questions, where can they get in touch with you?
Yes, you find my profile on Northumbria University's website. So if you search Edward Hall, Northumbria, there'll be a link there to that. Yeah, I really encourage people to get in touch and discuss this stuff. It's one of the topics that I think is gaining some foothold, certainly with in high performance context, is this idea of co-coaching. That I think there's a recognition of how essential it is. But certainly reach out. I'm not on social media, so yeah, it'd be through email would be the ideal mechanism. So it'd be edward.hall@northumbria.ac.uk.
Yeah, big thank you for your time today, Edward.
No, pleasure. Thanks, David. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, sports coaches have a tough job. It's certainly a lot more complex than people would consider, as Edward has highlighted today. I thoroughly enjoyed picking his brains and sincerely hope that you found this episode insightful. Enjoy your day. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sports psychology resources. The Sport Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.